All right, so get ready because we are diving into some really interesting research today. We got sent this paper, and it's all about ivermectin and how it could potentially be used to fight cancer.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating stuff. Our goal today is to kind of cut through all the noise that's out there,
Mhm.
and really give you a clear picture of what this research actually says.
That's exactly what I like to hear. I mean, everyone knows I love a good deep dive, and this one is definitely right up our alley, especially with all the talk about ivermectin lately. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind a bit. What's the story behind ivermectin? Where did it even come from?
Well, it all goes back to the fight against parasites, really.
Hmm.
You see, ivermectin comes from this family of drugs called avermectins, and these are like the heavy hitters when it comes to anti-parasitic medications. In fact, the discovery of ivermectin was a pretty huge deal, even won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine back in 2015.
That's right. Ivermectin's kind of a rock star in the world of fighting those parasitic diseases. But I'm curious, for those of us who don't spend all day thinking about this stuff, how does it actually work? How does it actually get rid of those tiny little invaders?
So to put it simply, ivermectin basically targets the nervous systems of those parasites.
Hmm.
It kind of paralyzes and then eliminates them. It's been a total game changer, especially for diseases like river blindness, particularly in countries where resources might be limited.
Wow, so it's like a neurological weapon against parasites? That's pretty wild. But this is where my brain starts to melt a little. How do we go from this drug that's clearly a powerhouse against parasites to even thinking about using it to fight cancer? Those seem like two completely different ball games.
You're telling me that's actually what makes this research so incredibly interesting.
Correct.
Because what we're seeing is the possibility of this one drug having multiple uses, potentially working in completely different ways to fight both those parasites and cancer cells.
Okay, now you've got my full attention. So let's break this down a bit. This research really dives into how ivermectin affects a whole range of different cancers. What were some of the biggest findings that stood out to you?
Well, one important thing to remember is that a lot of the research they did, what we call preclinical studies, was mostly done in labs, using cells in a dish or sometimes in animals. So, while these kinds of studies are super important as those first steps, we always have to keep in mind that what we see in a lab setting doesn't always perfectly translate to what happens in real people.
Right. Of course, we got to stay grounded in that. So what were some of the specific cancers they looked at? What were they seeing in the lab?
So they looked at a pretty wide variety, everything from breast cancer to digestive system cancers like colorectal cancer, urinary system cancers, and even blood cancers like leukemia. And the really fascinating thing was that ivermectin seemed to be actually inhibiting the growth of several types of cancer cells, at least in these controlled lab settings.
Okay, hold on. Back up a sec. When you say inhibiting growth, what does that actually mean?
Good question. Basically, it means that those cancer cells weren't multiplying and spreading the way they normally would. Now, the way ivermectin did this seemed to be different depending on the type of cancer. For example, with some of the breast cancer cells, ivermectin actually seemed to trigger something called apoptosis.
Apoptosis. Wait, that rings a bell. Can you remind me what that is again?
Sure, apoptosis is basically a form of programmed cell death. Like imagine the cell has a self-destruct button, and apoptosis is what happens when that button gets pushed. It's totally natural, and the cell basically dismantles itself in a very controlled way.
So is it like ivermectin is going in there and flipping that self-destruct switch on those cancer cells? That's pretty incredible.
It is pretty amazing. Now, with some of those other cancers, those digestive system cancers like colorectal cancer, it seemed like ivermectin was messing with some really specific pathways that those cancers absolutely need in order to grow and spread. For example, ivermectin was shown to block the Wnt pathway. Super important for cells to grow and develop properly.
Interesting. So it's almost like ivermectin is acting like, I don't know, a wrench or something, jamming itself right into the gears of those cancerous processes and gumming up the works. Were there any other ways that ivermectin was working against those cancer cells?
Definitely. The researchers also saw that ivermectin sometimes triggered another process called autophagy. You think of kind of like the cell's recycling system.
Okay, I've heard that before, but I'm a little fuzzy on the details. How does that play into fighting cancer?
Well, basically, during autophagy, the cell breaks down some of its own parts and then reuses those components. But sometimes this recycling process can end up killing the cell, especially if it's happening too quickly or intensely.
And what they're seeing is that ivermectin might actually be making that happen. Like it's ramping up the recycling to the point where it just overwhelms the cancer cell.
Yeah, that's the idea. And they saw this happening in a few different kinds of cancers too, like in breast cancer and even in a type of brain cancer called glioma.
So it sounds like we're seeing ivermectin potentially using multiple different tactics to fight off these cancer cells, apoptosis, autophagy. Were there any other major mechanisms of action at play?
Absolutely. They found that ivermectin might disrupt the way some cancers use chloride ions, these little charged particles. And here's the really interesting part. There's evidence that ivermectin could potentially make other cancer treatments even more effective, like it could be that secret weapon that boosts their power.
Okay, yeah, I'm definitely starting to see why this research is causing such a stir. It seems like we've only just scratched the surface of how ivermectin might work against cancer cells.
You're absolutely right in this. And one more really interesting thing throughout the research, they keep coming back to this enzyme called PAK1 kinase. It seems like this enzyme is a major player in a lot of the cancers where ivermectin was showing promise.
PAK1 kinase, that's definitely going on the list of things I need to brush up on. But before we get too far down that road, tell me more about this PAK1 kinase. Why is this particular enzyme so important when we're talking about ivermectin and its potential as a cancer treatment?
Okay, so PAK1 kinase is involved in a whole bunch of things that happen inside the cell. Things that can really go haywire when cancer starts to develop.
Yeah.
We're talking cell growth, we're talking about how cells survive, even how cancer cells move around and spread to different parts of the body.
So it sounds like this PAK1 is like this central hub that has its hands in a lot of different processes that make cancer so dangerous.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. The research suggests that ivermectin might be messing with this kinase somehow. Like, imagine it going in there and disrupting those cancer-promoting processes.
That's huge. Messing with something that's so important to how cancer works. Okay, I can definitely see why they're making such a big deal about this PAK kinase, but hold on a sec before we dive too deep into the weeds on that. We were talking about all the different ways that ivermectin might be fighting off these cancer cells. Are there any other mechanisms at play? I think you mentioned something earlier about, was it pyroptosis?
You got it. Good memory.
Hmm.
Yeah, we definitely need to talk about pyroptosis.
Pyroptosis. Okay, now that one sounds pretty intense, even just the name.
It's definitely one of the newer forms of cell death that researchers have discovered, and it's all tied to inflammation.
Hmm.
Think of it like the cell is going out in a blaze of glory, taking the fight right to those cancerous invaders.
Haha, that's one way to put it. So how does this pyroptosis fit into the picture of ivermectin as a potential cancer treatment?
That's the million-dollar question. And, I have to be honest, the research on this is still pretty early. But there are some hints that ivermectin might be able to kickstart this inflammatory kind of cell death in certain cancer cells.
Interesting. So we've got apoptosis, which is that controlled self-destruction. We've got autophagy, that cellular recycling process gone a bit haywire. And now we've got pyroptosis, this inflammatory battle cry. Ivermectin sounds like it's quite the multitasker when it comes to fighting cancer.
That's a really good way to put it. It's not just relying on one strategy. It might actually have a whole arsenal of tactics it can use against those cancer cells.
That brings me to a question that I'm sure is on everyone's mind after hearing all of this. I mean, we've talked about a lot of different cancers, and ivermectin seems to be showing some real potential in these lab studies. But what does it all mean? Should people be getting their hopes up?
Oh, man. That's the question, isn't it? And I think it's really, really important to emphasize how early this research is. Remember, we're mostly talking about studies that were done in petri dishes or sometimes in animals. And as amazing as those findings are, we really need to see if they actually hold true in people.
So the next big step is to see if ivermectin can really live up to the hype in human trials.
Exactly. It's way too soon to definitively say whether ivermectin will be the next big breakthrough. We have to be cautious and acknowledge the limitations of what we know so far.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of something that could be huge, but we always want to make sure we're staying grounded in the science. So, where do we go from here? What are the next steps in really understanding ivermectin's potential in the fight against cancer?
For me, this research really opens the door to this really cool area called drug repurposing. Basically, it's all about finding new uses for drugs that we already have, which could save so much time and money compared to trying to develop a brand new drug from scratch.
I love that. It's like taking something you already know and discovering a whole new purpose for it. How could researchers use this research with ivermectin to explore some of those new purposes?
Well, one thing they could do is really dig deep into exactly how ivermectin interacts with that PAK1 kinase we were talking about. And they could do that across lots of different cancer types. Like, imagine finding the one weakness that multiple cancers share. Then, they could use that knowledge to develop even more targeted treatments.
That's incredible. Are there other avenues researchers could be going down based on what they're seeing?
Oh, absolutely. Remember how we were saying that ivermectin seems to be even more effective at fighting certain cancers when it's combined with treatments that are already being used? That synergy is definitely something worth investigating further.
So we could potentially see combination therapies that include ivermectin to make those other drugs work even better.
You got it. That's exactly what I'm talking about. This research just opens up a whole new world of possibilities for how we approach cancer treatment.
It's amazing how often scientific discoveries lead to more questions than answers, isn't it? What are some of the other thought-provoking questions that this research raises for you?
One that I find really interesting is whether we could potentially develop what we call ivermectin derivatives. Basically, could we create tweaked versions of the drug, versions that are even better at fighting cancer and maybe even have fewer side effects?
Now, those are some questions worth pondering. And with that, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into ivermectin and all its possibilities as a cancer-fighting agent. We hope you've enjoyed this journey into the incredible world of scientific discovery as much as we have.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the possibilities, doesn't it? Like, what if we could actually, fine-tune these existing drugs or even come up with totally new ones based on what we're learning?
Absolutely. It just shows how important it is to always be asking those questions, always exploring, right? And sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from the places we least expect. I mean, who would have thought that a drug we use to fight parasites could actually hold so much promise for treating cancer?
It's true. It just goes to show how complex biology really is. Everything's interconnected. These cellular processes, they're all intertwined.
And that's what makes this research so exciting to me. It's not just about finding one magic bullet, right?
Wow.
It's about understanding this whole intricate web of interactions happening inside a cell and how we can maybe tweak those interactions to stop cancer in its tracks.
You hit the nail on the head. It's not just about ivermectin itself. It's about the possibilities it opens up. It's about those aha moments, those new ways of thinking about how we treat cancer.
Exactly. This research could change everything. The way we approach drug development, how we think about cancer therapies, it's huge. And it all comes back to that fundamental drive to explore, to understand, even when things take an unexpected turn.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And speaking of unexpected turns, that reminds me, we were talking about all the amazing ways that ivermectin might be working against these cancer cells. And there's one more we haven't touched on yet, pyroptosis.
Oh, that's right. Pyroptosis. Now that one sounds pretty hardcore, even just the name itself.
Well, I know, right? It's definitely one of the more recently discovered ways that cells can die, and it's all about inflammation. Picture this. The cell is going down, but it's going down swinging. It's like it's taking the fight right to those cancer cells.
Ah, I like that image. So where does this pyroptosis thing fit into the whole ivermectin as a cancer treatment story?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I got to be honest, the research on this is still in its very early stages, but there are some hints that just maybe ivermectin might be able to trigger this whole inflammatory kind of cell death in certain types of cancer.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this straight. We've got apoptosis, that's the controlled self-destruction, right? Then there's autophagy, which is like the cell's recycling system gone rogue. And now we're adding pyroptosis to the mix. It's the inflammatory battle cry. It's like ivermectin has all these different weapons it can use, all these different ways to take down those cancer cells.
That's a great way to put it. It's not just a one-trick pony, right? It might actually have a whole arsenal of tricks up its sleeve.
Okay, so now for the question that I know is on everyone's mind. We've talked about a lot of different cancers, and in the lab at least, ivermectin seems to be pretty darn promising. But what does all this actually mean for people who are dealing with cancer right now? Should they be getting their hopes up about this?
That is the question, isn't it? And, it's so important to be upfront about this. This research is still super early. We're mostly talking about stuff that's been done in a lab, in those petri dishes, or sometimes in animals. And as incredible as these findings are, we really, really need to see if those same results hold true in actual humans.
So the next big hurdle is to see how ivermectin performs in those human trials, to see if it can really live up to all the hype.
Exactly. It's just way too early to say for sure whether ivermectin is going to be the next big breakthrough.
Yeah.
We've got to be careful, be realistic, and acknowledge that there are still some limitations to what we know right now.
You're absolutely right. It's so easy to get caught up in the excitement of something that could be huge, something that could really change things. But at the end of the day, we've always got to stay grounded in the science, and the science says we need more data. So where do we go from here? What are the next steps in figuring out just how powerful ivermectin could be in this fight against cancer?
Well, I think this research really shines a spotlight on this whole concept of drug repurposing, and I think that's really exciting. We're basically talking about finding new uses for drugs that are already out there, which could save us tons of time and resources compared to starting from scratch with a brand new drug.
I love that. It's like we're taking something familiar and discovering this whole new side to it, this hidden potential. What are some specific ways that researchers could build on this ivermectin research, using that drug repurposing approach?
Well, for starters, I think we really need to double down on understanding how ivermectin interacts with that PAK1 kinase we were talking about earlier, and not just in one type of cancer, but across the board. What if, what if we could find that one chink in the armor, that one weakness that a whole bunch of different cancers share? That would be huge for developing more targeted therapies.
Now, that is what I'm talking about, finding the Achilles heel of cancer. What other avenues could researchers be looking at based on these findings?
Oh, there are tons of possibilities. Remember how we were talking about how ivermectin seems to be even more effective against some cancers when you combine it with other treatments that are already being used? There's a goldmine of possibilities there.
You mean like developing combination therapies where ivermectin is part of the mix, making those other drugs even more powerful?
Bingo. That's exactly what I'm talking about. This research just opens up this whole new world of possibilities for how we approach cancer treatment. And I, for one, am really excited to see where it leads.
It never ceases to amaze me how scientific discoveries often lead to more questions than answers. What are some of the other big, thought-provoking questions that this research raises for you?
But one that I find particularly intriguing is whether we could develop what we call ivermectin derivatives. So basically, could we tweak the structure of ivermectin a bit, make some modifications, and create even more effective versions? Versions that are even better at fighting cancer and maybe have fewer side effects. Now, that would be something.
Now, those are some questions worth pondering, and I think that's a perfect place to wrap up this part of our deep dive into ivermectin and its incredible potential in the fight against cancer. Yeah, those are some really big questions, and honestly, that potential for creating even more effective treatments with fewer side effects, that's what gets me really fired up.
Absolutely. And it all comes back to this idea of pushing the boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Not being afraid to ask those what ifs and explore those uncharted territories. That's how we make progress.
Exactly. And sometimes those biggest leaps forward come from those unexpected places, like with this whole ivermectin thing. It just goes to show you never know where that next big breakthrough is going to come from.
It's like that saying, the only constant is change. And that's definitely true in the world of science, especially when we're talking about something as complex and as challenging as cancer.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, wouldn't you say? We've gone from those early days of ivermectin as a parasite-fighting champ all the way to these mind-blowing possibilities for using it to fight cancer.
We've talked about apoptosis, autophagy, pyroptosis, all those different ways ivermectin might be working against those cancer cells. And of course, we can't forget about that mysterious PAK1 kinase, right?
Definitely not. That PAK1 kinase is definitely one to watch for sure.
Absolutely. And beyond the specifics of ivermectin, we've also really been exploring this bigger picture of drug repurposing and just how much potential there is in that approach.
It's such an exciting time to be following all this research, wouldn't you say? So much happening, so much potential for new discoveries and breakthroughs.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, we're talking about potentially transforming the way we approach cancer treatment, and that's huge.
It really is. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this incredible deep dive into the world of ivermectin and its potential in the fight against cancer. We've explored a ton of exciting research today, and we hope you've learned a lot about this fascinating drug and the incredible possibilities it holds.
Absolutely. And even though those human trials are still on the horizon, I think it's safe to say that ivermectin has definitely earned its place in the spotlight. It's a contender, for sure, and we'll be watching closely to see what the future holds.
Well said. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and that curiosity alive.